Hello everyone, Mr. B here. So we're finally in to Unit 4, which is the last unit of the Intro to Psychology, which has just 3 more chapters. Chapters 10, 11, and 13. So we're going to go ahead and go into Chapter 10. And we're actually going to be covering this entire chapter in one video. So as you can see looking at the review guide, there's quite a lot of questions that cover Chapter 10, but we're going to be going through them very, very quickly. Because it's a relatively short chapter, but there's a lot of really important things to talk about in this chapter because it has to do with stress. But without further ado, let's get started. So as I mentioned, Chapter 10 has to do with stress. And the very first thing that you will need to know is what we mean by stress. And so what stress is, as far as we're concerned in this class, is the pressures or demand placed upon us to adjust or adapt to our environment. So at any point, if there's some sort of a demand, some sort of a pressure that's placed upon you in your environment, that's a stress. Doesn't necessarily have to be something negative. When we're working on something, like let's say that you want to get really good at a sport or an activity, and so you work really, really hard on it, that's a stress. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. And so you'll see the question that's at the bottom of this is it says, is stress always a bad thing? And I will be including a video, and I apologize for that noise. That would be my cat running around. Stress is not necessarily a bad thing, and there's this wonderful TED Talk that's all about stress. It talks about the research that's out there, which I will be including, so please do watch it. But long story short, what the findings are in that TED Talk and the research that was done is found that stress is only dangerous to our health when we see it as being a negative thing. That stress is a bad thing. But when you see stress in a different light, when you change your perception, and you instead see stress as, this is something where my body is doing, what it's supposed to do. There's this pressure or demand, and my body's got this. My sympathetic nervous system is going into gear, and it's rearing me up, and I'm going to tackle this obstacle. If you view stress like that, you don't see the kind of bad health outcomes as those that see stress as a negative thing. But again, there's a wonderful video that talks about the research in that. But just remember, as we're going through all these things about stress, that stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. And if we change the way that we view stress, it will help us in the long run. So how do we deal with stress? This is a little dated, as you'll see, but a lot of them are still probably in the top 5, because this was from a couple of years back. So listening to music is a way that helps a lot of people deal with stress. Exercising and walking is another huge one. Thank you, Jake. Going online or surfing the internet. I would say now, just doing anything that involves the internet. So like different social media platforms, watching TikToks, going on Instagram, stuff like that also helps. Watching TV, going to the movies. I would also add things like Netflix, things like that. And then socializing with your friends or family and reading was tied at the time that this research was done. But those are just some of the kind of main ways that we see that people deal with stress, but there's many, many other ways. I would also argue, of course, that these are kind of some of the healthy options out there. There's some unhealthy ones, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. And then these are sources of stress. So when people get stressed out, these are kind of the top causes of stress. And again, you can look at these at your own time, but a lot of them are no-brainers. So, money, work, relationships, family responsibilities, health problems, the economy, etc. So the next thing that you'll need to know for the exam are quite a few things that we're going to be talking about, and these are all different sources of stress. And the first one is this idea of a hassle. And what a hassle is just these minor little annoyances that add up. So let's say, that you're stuck in traffic. And then, finally you get to your destination and you realize you left something at home. And then you're leaving your car and it starts raining. It's just this idea of teeny little things that just continually are going wrong, and they add up. That's what we mean by a hassle. Just minor inconveniences. Another source of stress is huge life events. So just anything that, changes, they're like major circumstances that, change your life, is a life event, and they cause stress. So you'll see some of the examples are here, which is going to happen to a lot of you. Moving away, to go to college, is a stressful situation. It can cause stress. Getting married is stressful. That's a huge change to your life, or having kids of your own. These are all examples of sources of stress. And again, they're not necessarily bad, because stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that there's these obstacles that you have to overcome. And one thing that you will need to know for life events, and it isn't on here, but it's important for college goers, is there was a survey that was done that was looking at the thing that was rated the highest as a stressful situation or a stressful life event for college students, and that was, unfortunately, rape. So you do need to know that for the exam. So the life event that was rated highest for college students that caused stress was rape, which is unfortunate. But it's one of those things that when it does happen, it causes a lot of stress. So to know that for the exam. Another source of stress is a frustration. So a hassle was a really, really minor inconvenience. A life event is this big event. Frustration is something where it's like a roadblock. You're trying to do something, and something is preventing you from getting there. That's a frustration. So again, it gives the definition: a negative emotional state that occurs when our efforts to pursue our goals are blocked or thwarted. So you will need to know that definition for the exam. And some very common sources of frustration are technology. You're trying to get a paper done, you're trying to do an assignment, and the internet goes out, the web page isn't loading, something like that that's preventing you from getting where you need to go. That's a frustration. Another source of stress are conflicts. And there's many, many different types of conflicts. And this might look a little confusing, but when you actually do examples for each, it gets a little less confusing. And you will need to know, especially for the exam, the approach-approach conflict. And the approach-approach conflict is essentially, there's something that you need to do, there's a conflict, and both options are positive. You're motivated to do both, options or goals. Classic example of this is, let's say that you want to go to the movies, and there's 2 movies showing at the same time that you want to see, but you can only pick one. Or, there's a place you want to go out to eat, but you can only pick one. Every option's good. You like every option, but you can only pick one. That's the approach-approach conflict. You then have the avoidance-avoidance conflict. This is one where, again, you have this goal, you have this conflict, something that you have to do, but both options you don't like. You want to avoid both. A classic example of this, for kids, let's say, is brushing your teeth or, going to the dentist. Or, even better still, going to the dentist versus not going to the dentist, but then needing to get a lot of work done on your teeth, getting cavities. Cavities aren't fun. Going to the dentist isn't fun. You don't want to do either of those, but you still have to pick one. It's one or the other. That's an avoidance conflict. Then you have approach avoidance conflict, and this is where there's kind of one option, but there's both a good and bad side to it. So an example of this, let's say you want to go to college. And so you choose to go to college, but because you're going to college, you now have a bunch of student loans. But, now that you're going to college, your chances of getting a better paying job are greater. So this is an example where it's both something positive and negative to the same thing that you're picking. And adding on that still, and this is the other one that you will need to know for the exam, the multiple approach avoidance is kind of how a lot of things in real life are, where there's multiple goals or multiple things that you can pick for some sort of conflict, but they're both good and bad. So there's a positive and negative to any option that you pick. So I'm going to go back to the whole idea of, you can go to college or you cannot go to college. Those are two options. We've already kind of talked about it, but going to college, a positive is, that you have a much better chance of getting a better paying job, which is good. But the bad side is student loans, which is bad. If you don't go to college, though, the positives is, you can go and get a job right off the bat. You don't have to worry about student loans. But then the negatives is that you might not be able to get a really good or higher paying job. You might get raises, but it can only go so far. So there's good and bad sides to either solution, and you kind of have to weigh those options. And that is the multiple approach avoidant conflict. Another source of stress is, of course, and this kind of goes back to kind of the highest rated life event as well, but a traumatic experience. So if you have a traumatic experience in your life, of course, that causes a lot of stress. And if it is a very traumatic experience, you could experience something known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which was kind of most commonly associated with people who went to war and returned from war, getting PTSD. But we now know that anyone who experiences any sort of a traumatic event can get PTSD. And for the sake of the exam, what you will need to know are some of the symptoms. So there's, an avoidance of anything associated with trauma. There's re-experiencing the traumatic event in some way, shape, or form. Having impaired functioning. Having a heightened arousal. And then this emotional numbing. So these are all different symptoms that you could see for someone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also something known as a type A behavior pattern. And these are just people that are highly competitive. They can become hostile or aggressive kind of easily. Someone who, a classic example if you get road rage when you're driving, would be a classic example of a type A behavior pattern. And the thing to know for the exam is that those with a type A behavior pattern tend to have increased risk for coronary heart disease, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail later on. And then finally, as far as sources of stress are concerned, there's this idea of acculturation. And this is stress that comes about for those that are moving from one culture to another. Because there's this stress of trying to balance who you are and, the culture that you came from with this new culture. Because it's been found, if you completely abandon your past culture, that can cause stress. And if you refuse to adapt to the new culture, that also causes stress. And for the sake of the exam, what you will need to know comes on this screen, and it's kind of adjustments of immigrant groups that works best for combating this. So economic opportunities, language proficiencies, ethnic identification, and a supportive social network are all things that help with all acculturative stress. So that's another thing that you will need to know for the exam. We then get into how we respond to stress. So we just talked about all these different sources. Now, how does our body respond to all these different things that can cause stress? And the first one is by Hans Selye, which I always think I'm pronouncing wrong. And he came up with the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS. And this is the whole idea that there is 3 main steps to how our body responds to stress. And for the exam, you will need to know these 3. So alarm, resistance, exhaustion. Alarm is, it's when your fight or flight system kicks in, which is something you also need to know for the exam. So it's when the alarms are going off. Your body realizes, oh, there's something happening, there's something stressful, it's time for us to get ready to tackle this stress. Then we go into resistance. So this is when your body is fighting that stress. It's resisting that stressful situation. It's getting you through it. And then eventually you get into the last stage, which is exhaustion. So it's the whole idea that your body can only fight for so long. It eventually does need to rest. And so either, you get through the stressful situation, or, you reach a point where you just can't fight it. You have to rest first, and then you can go back and tackle it. So those are the 3 stages. And again, for the exam, you'll need to know those 3 by name. You also need to know that in that alarm stage, this is when your fight or flight is kicking in. Then we get into your body's response again for what's going on physiologically. And so the thing to know about this is that your hypothalamus is what starts it all. Your hypothalamus communicates, and we talked about this before yesterday, when we talked about the endocrine system, where your hypothalamus communicates with your other glands, so your pituitary gland, and then there's all sorts of different hormones and different chemicals that are secreted that, again, get your body ready to fight a stress. But because we have talked about this before, and we talked about the endocrine system, the thing that you will need to know, especially for the exam, is, again, where it starts is with the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus starts it all. Yes, it does. Then another way that your body responds to stress, and this is also important when it comes to different illnesses, is your immune system. And so the things to know about your immune system is that there's 2 main parts. You have antibodies and lymphocytes. Antibodies are what kind of mark antigens, or kind of foreign invaders in your body that aren't good for you. And so they mark it. They're like, oh, we don't know this antigen. This is going to make us sick. And then you have, and this is what you will need to know for the exam, the lymphocytes. And the lymphocytes are kind of the artillery. They're what fight off that, foreign invader, that antigen. So again, to specifically know for the exam, know that lymphocytes are specialized white blood cells that protect the body against diseases. We're almost done. Psychological moderators of stress. So we talked about how your body responds to it kind of physiologically, but there's also things that you can do psychologically. And so you have all these different stressors. So you have some examples here. And then, these stressors, if you're not really doing anything to combat or kind of fight against these stressors, it can lead to a lot of negative effects of stress. But as we mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, stress is not necessarily a bad thing. Only if you essentially see it as a bad thing, then that's when you see more of these negative effects. But there's all sorts of things that you can combat stress with, which are known as psychological moderators. So you have social support, self-efficacy, your perception of control or predictability, psychological hardiness, and optimism. And these are things that you will need to know, again, on the exam. What are some examples of psychological moderators? So again, having people that can help and support you, kind of taking control of the situation, realizing, that you're not in a helpless situation, you can do something about it. Having psychological hardiness, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. And then optimism, again, having this more positive view of the situation. And again, I cannot stress it enough. When it comes to stress, don't see it as a bad thing. See it as, okay, this is an obstacle and I'm going to overcome it and then I'm going to grow from that experience. That can really help with combating stress. And as I mentioned with psychological hardiness, there's 3 main traits for psychological hardiness, and you will need to know this for the exam as well. They're also known, or a way to remember them, is the 3 C's. So commitment, challenge, and control. So commitment means that, there's a stressful situation going on in your life and you are committed to seeing it through. Openness to challenge means that you're not afraid, to do something new, even if it might be stressful. Because sometimes people avoid something because they just don't want the stressful situation. but being open for that challenge and that obstacle. And then finally, an internal locus of control. So realizing that, you have control over that situation, you have control over that stressor, and you can make it through. Those are all examples of what we consider psychological hardiness. So that's all about stress. The other part, which I'm going to go through very, very quickly, because I know I don't want this video to get too long, is this idea of psychological factors when it comes to physical illness. So stress is kind of more of this mental thing that can happen that can cause different physical illnesses. Now we're going to go into specific physical illnesses. And the first one, which was mentioned earlier, is coronary heart disease. So if you're a type A personality type, you're more at risk for this. But there's many other risks as well, and this you will need to know for the exam. So if you're a smoker, if you have high blood pressure, if you're overweight, if you're physically inactive, if you have high blood glucose, if you have high of LDL cholesterol, which is known as the bad cholesterol, and then if you are a constant alcohol user, so if you drink a lot of alcohol. So these are all risk factors, which again, you will need to know for the exam. And then this is just a little thing, and I won't go into huge detail, but it's important for people to know, because a lot of times people take on bad habits and then they, think, well, why quit? I've already hurt my body. But it's amazing how quickly, in a sense, your body can recover sometimes. And I mean, it can take a while for some things, but you can start to see positive benefits and health benefits really quickly. And so this is just an example for quitting smoking, where your heart rate drops after 20 minutes without smoking. After 12 hours, the carbon monoxide levels in your blood drops back to normal. Ability to smell and taste improve, and you'll see that as time goes on, there's more and more health benefits. So the thing to take away from this is that it's never too late to quit a bad habit. And then when it comes to cancer, the things to know about this, there's all sorts of behaviors you can do to help prevent cancer. If you know that cancer runs in your family, it's especially important to kind of practice these preventative measures. So avoiding tobacco use, so that's more for things like lung cancer, throat cancer, if it's chewing tobacco, then mouth cancer. This one will help you for the exam. Because it's worded a little bit confusingly, but it says that if you use alcohol, limit consumption to one drink per day if you're a woman, or 2 drinks per day if you're a man. The exam is a little tricky because it talks about certain numbers of alcohol, so it doesn't sound like something necessarily positive for preventative measures, but keep that in mind. Being physically active, having a healthy diet, maintaining a healthy weight, avoid unprotected exposure to the sun, so that's for like skin cancer. And yes, sunblock helps a bit, but it's even better to avoid unprotected exposure, meaning like just wear clothes, have a hat, have an umbrella, things like that. And then get regular medical examinations. So early screening is crucial. And so that's just kind of an overview of just a few, there's so many things we could talk about for illnesses, but those are kind of some of the main ones where there's all sorts of things that you can do to combat it. But that is actually it for Chapter 10. So I know I kind of went through it really quickly, and there's a lot of stuff that you need to know that's on the exam. A lot of stuff is kind of common sense, so keep that in mind. But know that you can always go back, watch this video again. Again, I know I went through kind of quickly, and I apologize for that. But when we come back, we'll be starting with Chapter 11, which will be split up into different parts because it tackles a lot of different perspectives.